Hello, welcome everybody to the National Association of Scholars webinar on, formally, the anatomy of a diversity, equity, and inclusion takeover, which is to say, we are focusing on the DEI or DIE, D-I-E, a takeover in higher education, how precisely it's being done, which bureaucracies, which students, which means bias report teams. We are focusing on studies of 3 states in particular. Joel Gardner, attorney, investment banker, alumnus board member at the University of Virginia, will be speaking to us about the University of Virginia system. John Seiler, a research associate at the National Association of Scholars, I'm delighted he's my colleague, will be speaking about the University of Arizona system. And Scott Yenner, a professor of political science at Boise State University and a Washington Fellow at Claremont Institute, will be talking about the University of North Carolina. Now, I should say, this is being co-sponsored by the National Association of Scholars, and I'm delighted, the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, which also had a role in publishing both of the work by Joel Gardner and Scott Yenner. And the Martin Center, since 2003, the voice for excellence in higher education. Its purpose is particularly to renew and fulfill the promise of higher education in North Carolina and across the country. The Martin Center advocates for public policy solutions to address issues of university governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, higher education regulations, and university spending, which is to say, everything that NAS is for, they're for. And I must say, if you read their website regularly, every time I go there, there's always something wonderful to find and read. So I just strongly endorse putting them onto your permanent web bookmarks. So having said all that, what are we going to be talking about now is 12 to 14 minutes each in alphabetical order by last name, then Q&A. You, the guests, should lob in questions either in the chat or the Q&A buttons. The panelists can look at them themselves, or I will repeat and lob them to them. Any questions that don't get answered, you can send email to me at randall@nas.org. I will forward them to the panelists later so they can have the option to answer you. So don't worry about a question not getting answered. And this will be recorded for posterity and up on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. Having said that, I'm delighted to say, Mr. Gardner.
Thanks, David. First of all, I would like to thank the National Association of Scholars and the James Martin Center for co-hosting this webinar on this extremely important subject, because I think for those who are in the know and are involved, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, what I would call a political movement, has probably the greatest danger today as administered on college campuses to freedom of thought and freedom of expression and academic integrity at institutions of higher learning. Just a quick background, I graduated from UVA in 1970 with a history degree from its law school in 1974, never really departed from Charlottesville in spirit. I've served on 4 different boards at the university, have spearheaded a half a dozen fundraising efforts, had 2 children who went to school there. So on an ongoing basis, I have been involved with UVA pretty much continuously since 1966. And I think we're coming into DEI. I think it was the first hearing about it was really with the birth of identity politics in the 2000s, maybe the mid 2000s. You started hearing about this movement, but it was not overwhelming, but it continued to grow. And that was fine. It was really the basis of discussion. I don't think it became a predominant ideology or mandate, at least at UVA. until sometime in the early 2000s. And I actually bought a home in Charlottesville, retired from my day job, wrote a book about my 4 years as an undergraduate, which was published 2 years later. But I was very involved. I was on a board. My wife was on a board. She was on the Arts Council there. And I started to see the concepts of race and gender and ethnicity crawling into every nook and cranny of life at UVA. And we were very involved in the arts, but you could see it coming with the art museum, with the film festival, with dance, with theater. Suddenly everything was about race and gender. And it really exploded in Charlottesville after the Unite the Right march in August of 2017. And that event, which really had little or nothing to do with the University of Virginia, was weaponized by what I would call the social justice crowd to start pushing a social agenda. And of course, it then accelerated even more with the George Floyd tragedy 2 years later. But I think what is most important to understand for those who have not been involved on an ongoing basis on college campuses is that the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not, in the manner in which it's applied, really have anything to really to do with academic diversity, has really very little to do with concept of equality of opportunity. And if anything, it's more exclusive than inclusive. And I think it was very well put by former dean of the law school at Yale, Anthony Kronman, when he said, and I'll quote, "The demand for ever greater diversity in higher education is a political campaign masquerading as an educational ideal." And that's exactly, because it is not an academic ideal. It is, in fact, a political movement. And as a political movement, it has its place. I mean, it's open for discussion, and that's what a university is about. But it has not become a subject just open for discussion. It has become, in fact, a mandated ideology that needs to be accepted by pretty much anybody affiliated with the university. And a couple of years ago, a number of concerned alumni at the University of Virginia started speaking out. And really, this is very key. You're not going to get the faculty, the students, or the parents really ready to stand up and challenge, because they're all intimidated, whether it's social intimidation, professional intimidation, fear for their children's future. They will not speak up. It really is left on many campuses to the alumni. And we started to speak up. I wrote a number of articles. I wrote an open letter to the president, Jim Ryan. I wrote an article for the James Martin Center about the dangerous politicization of college campuses. And that did get a hearing. A lot of alumni started to get involved. And to their credit, the administration did last year create a committee for free expression and free inquiry. And I was the only independent person that was placed on this board of 12, which was very ideologically overbalanced with progressive and woke ideology. But we did come up, during our committee meetings, we canvassed members of the university community. And I had been speaking for years with faculty members, administrators, and students. And the stories I had heard about intellectual indoctrination and thought intimidation had been quite staggering. And during our committee, we heard even more. And what we heard during the committee, during our hearings, either in call-in sessions or in writing, were mostly coming from faculty who were finally found someplace they could speak up. They were talking about mandatory politicized training, compelled speech, homogenized teaching and training. This was coming from the faculty. Students were talking about double standards being applied to conservative students vis-a-vis liberal and radical students. And just to sum up, a faculty member who has taught, probably the most revered member of the UVA faculty in the 21st, 20th centuries, has taught more students than any other professor in the history of the university, termed what is going on at UVA today as a tragedy. And we adopted some principles, but I just wrote another article for the Martin Center because this is very key. While we were there, we were hearing things like many of the schools at the university were requiring mandatory diversity DEI statements in order to be hired. Not only what they've done in the past to support DEI, but what they will do in the future. And those were in a number of the schools of the university. Which was staggering. But after we adopted our principles, two things came out, which many of us thought were incredible, since we now have University of Chicago-like principles. Those two things were a member of the library, the University of Virginia library employee resigned from her position because she objected to the mandatory critical race theory training that was going on. And then we found out that the College of Arts and Sciences, which is the largest college as part of UVA, was requiring in its peer review process that faculty members, again, pledge allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both, again, to talk about what they've done in the past and what they intend to do in the future. And this last event, the mandatory requirement in faculty reviews, caught the attention of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the FIRE organization, which had given UVA a green light, which of course was only written previously on which was only determined on written protocols. And they sent a letter to Jim Ryan, the president of the university, Jim Ryan, a multiple-page letter discussing as to why, as a state university, which is bound by the First Amendment, requiring employees of the state to have to pledge fealty to any type of a political or social agenda is violative of the First Amendment. And that's only part of it. I think you have to recognize what DE&I is, not only in a political movement, but as a political movement, like most political movements do. They focus on two things, which is power and money. And the growth of DEI at UVA has been astonishing. There was a recent study by the Heritage Foundation, which showed that they looked at these 64 schools in the Power 5 conferences. I guess they just picked that as a universe. A lot of them state universities, there are some private universities involved, but they're all major universities. And of those 64, UVA ranks tied for second in number of DEI employees. They had 94 when the average was 45. But even worse was they were solidly in second position, not had been tied in terms of DEI employees in a ratio to faculty members. And it is all about the money there and the growth of the bureaucracy. So there are 12 schools at UVA, 12 colleges that make up the university. At least 8 of those now have their own DEI departments. In addition to the university's broad division of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has a huge staff and whose head, vice president, makes a lot more than most members of the faculty. 8 of the 12, at least 8 of them, may have been some more added since, at least 8 of the 12 schools have now brought on their own associate deans of DEI within their own schools and have built up their own internal bureaucracy within those schools. And as to the money, just to show you where this is, following the George Floyd incident, the university put together very quickly a task force to look into equity. And 2 out of the 3 leaders, co-chairs of the task force, astonishingly, hadn't even been at UVA for 1 year. So they were going to come up with recommendations based on what was going on at UVA when they had no real clue about the institutional history of the University of Virginia. And in fact, in the 50+ page summary that they submitted to the Board of Visitors, which was subsequently adopted, I believe, unanimously, they asked for $100 to $150 million to pursue immediately DEI agenda. And then that wasn't enough. They wanted 500 to 650 million, quote unquote, in perpetuity to promote their agenda. And just I'll end up by saying, what makes this whole thing astonishing is that DE&I, at least at UVA, is built on a total house of cards. I was at UVA, I started in 1966, when in fact there were the remnants of segregation, remnants of massive resistance in Virginia. And that all started to change my last 2 years. There was in fact a civil rights revolution went on at UVA. And certainly since the 1970s, there is no basis for finding any systemic racism at UVA. I've asked senior members of the administration, look, you're doing all this, you're taking all these actions, you've subsumed academia in this social agenda. Point out to me, where is the institutional racism in the last 50 years? Where is the systemic racism? And no one has been able to point out where it, in fact, de facto, on the ground, exists at that educational institution, at least since the 1970s.
Thank you. I think you've come to an end there, or
I can keep on going. I don't know have I used up my 15 minutes yet.
Well, it's been about 14 minutes, and everybody's going to have time to do more. So I figure I think I will jump in, since that seemed to be a pause, and go on quickly to Arizona, I think, and John Saylor. We'll get back to Virginia and Q&A.
Thanks, David. September 2021, ASU was the subject of a viral news story after 2 students harassed another pair of students in the university's multicultural center. So 2 female students confronted 2 white males. One of the men was wearing an anti-Joe Biden t-shirt. Another had a Police Lives Matter sticker on his laptop, and they both had Chick-fil-A cups on the table with them. The 2 female students who recorded the encounter themselves said that the male students made them uncomfortable. Later on, after the situation escalated, one of the female students asked the male students, "Do you understand what a multicultural space is? It means you," referring to the 2 gentlemen, "are not being centered." Later on, they continued by saying, "This is the only space that you're not centered. And you're trying to center yourself," which is peak white cis male BS. Eventually, the 2 male students left. And afterwards, it made something of a national news story. ASU responded in a good way. They responded by reprimanding the 2 female students for essentially bullying 2 students for expressing political beliefs in an extremely non-aggressive way, just by using bumper stickers and t-shirts. And in fact, early this year, it was reported that each of those students had to write a 3-page paper about what they would do differently. Of course, they objected and said that that form of punishment was something akin to racism, and it shows the bias inherent in the practice of ASU. But it's ironic that ASU responded to this instance of students shutting down speech and of students kind of acting on a radical ideology. These students espoused the view that certain people should be centered and other people should not be centered. They acted on the view that some political views and ideas, which are nationally very mainstream ideas, or at least very popular with a lot of the country, are outside the bounds of acceptable thought, and students should be protected from them because they can make students be uncomfortable. And Moreover, they displayed an obvious obsession with race and narrow identity categories, referring to these two gentlemen as white cis males who were purveyors of BS. This is ironic because at ASU, and in fact at all of Arizona's universities, the views that these two students, the two students who harassed the gentleman in the multicultural center, these views are not only institutional policy, but they increasingly dominate the curriculum in such a way that students can hardly avoid being taught them over and over again. My forthcoming report on the public universities in Arizona looks at how American history is taught at Arizona's Arizona's three major public universities: University of Arizona, Arizona State University, and Northern Arizona University. And you cannot talk about the way that American history is discussed at these, or is taught at these institutions, without also noting the precipitous rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. And I do want to emphasize those 2 points that I just made a few minutes ago. That first of all, these views that are that we would all, or many of us would see as radical, are reinforced again and again by institutional policy. And second, they increasingly dominate the curriculum in such a way that students just can't avoid being taught these particular ideas, whether you want to call them critical race theory, critical social justice, or what have you. So first, let's talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is institutional policy. And to do so, I really just want to give kind of an overview of some of the policies that have been recently enacted at these three universities. At ASU, for instance, the Office of the President recently announced that every incoming student and employee will undergo the To Be Welcoming training. That is, to be welcoming. This training program was originally designed by Starbucks for all of its employees, and it is essentially a crash course in concepts such as microaggressions, systemic injustice, and cultural appropriation. If you want to talk about American history at ASU, it's worth noting that while students are not at the moment required to take any American history course, or because students at the moment are not required to take any American history course, the only depiction of American history that every single student will be guaranteed to receive at ASU comes through this precise training program that emphasizes things like systemic injustice and the dangers of microaggressions. But that's not all. In fact, many of the departments at the university, or at ASU, also have implemented their own version of a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. So the university as a whole, after 2020, released its DEI plan that made several commitments to changing institutional policy, changing the way they recruit, enacting most notably the To Be Welcoming program that all students are required to take. But individual departments have also responded to, most notably, the kind of public outcry in 2020 by establishing their own DEI committees. So for instance, the School of Engineering committed to establishing metrics for faculty and staff evaluations that assess DEI contributions. And Joel mentioned that a similar policy had been enacted at UVA. And I would note that this is an increasingly common occurrence in universities across the country. As with a lot of other DEI policies, I suspect that once it's adopted by a few, it will become, over time, a kind of university standard. That, of course, is my prediction, but I have pretty good reason to believe that this is going to become more and more common, just as we saw DEI statements become more and more common for admissions and hiring. The College of Health Solutions promised to develop an inclusive teaching and learning committee to integrate JEDI, that is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles into the academic experience. The College of Integrative Science and Art proposed to update its course evaluation instrument to address inequities it perpetrates along gender and racial lines, and to add questions about diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice efforts in the classroom. I'll pause to note that while ASU reprimanded the two activist students who shouted down and eventually harassed their fellow university students and made them leave the multicultural center, the university ASU said that that was problematic, that they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have objected to somebody being present in the multicultural center or anywhere just on the basis of their political views. But when you have institutional policies that say we now are going to evaluate courses on the basis of their contribution to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice efforts, when you have promotion and tenure requirements that say faculty must demonstrate a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you essentially empower these students who very justly can say that certain political views are contrary to the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because as we know, the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least as they're interpreted by virtually anyone in the diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of cottage industry, those values are in conflict with certain political statements. So while ASU is on one hand committed to, or at least says they're committed to, free speech, free inquiry, diversity of opinion, on the other hand, they're implementing policies that can be used as a weapon to prevent free speech, diversity of opinion, and so forth. Similar policies have been adopted by University of Arizona, which is rolling out a series of department-level plans in addition to a university-wide climate survey and university-wide mandatory training. And Northern Arizona University goes, I would say, even further. A few of their university-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives include the following. First, institutionalize the value of diversity, and this is a quote, diversity-centered learning, service, scholarship, and work by embedding diversity as an important component of learning outcomes, professional development, performance expectations, and performance evaluations at all levels. Another commitment, incorporate diversity-centered work, professional development, service, and research and scholarship in evaluation and promotion and tenure criteria. This is not just one department that's establishing that policy. This is rather the whole university. And speaking of Northern Arizona University, this is a good segue into the other point I wanted to make, which is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is essentially the new core curriculum at universities, and especially at Arizona's universities. So on February 2nd, 2021, the Northern Arizona University's Liberal Arts Curriculum Committee had a meeting where the topic of foreign language courses came up. And according to the meeting notes, there was apparently a disagreement over whether foreign language courses could be counted as diversity courses. The committee concluded that they could not. And here's the rationale, quote, the courses have not been accepted as diversity courses because they do not incorporate critical theory, which the Diversity Curriculum Committee expects of the courses it approves. This is especially noteworthy because Northern Arizona University has recently increased the number of required diversity courses in its core curriculum. At that same February 2nd meeting, the Liberal Studies Curriculum Committee noted that diversity perspectives is now 4 categories. And they then moved to discuss whether that should be a 12 credit requirement or just a 9 credit requirement. By September 2nd of 2021, it was decided, and the Diversity Curriculum Committee noted that the 12 credits of diversity requirements are unprecedented and put Northern Arizona University at the forefront of higher education. I would take this as a pretty good sign of what's to come. And I'll end on just one more example of what this looks like in practice, because each university does not only emphasizes DEI in their institutional policy, they also emphasize DEI in very specific and ideologically charged ways in their curriculum. And so I'll end on an example from University of Arizona. They at University of Arizona, their new core requirements requires each course to have an attribute. One of the 4 attributes is diversity and equity. So if you do not emphasize mathematics, global awareness, or writing, then you have to, by default, to have a general studies course, to have a course on diversity and equity. And the checklist that they provide asks the following questions. First, and this is the checklist for determining whether your course qualifies as a diversity and equity course. First question, does my course do all 3 of the following? Center one or more marginalized populations inside the United States, explore how relationships among diversity, power, equity, and social justice have been analyzed and debated through the lens of one or more disciplinary perspectives inside the United States, and ensure that voices from the communities or societies that are studied in the course are centered in the syllabus. And then it says that you must satisfy one of the 3 following requirements. And I will end on these after I read these. So each diversity and equity course must do at least one of the following. First, focus on how social, environmental, institutional, and political or other systemic structures influence how knowledge is constructed, and whether historically or contemporarily. 2, support students in comprehending how individuals, communities, and societies experience privilege and oppression/marginalization. 3, support students in promoting meaningful action at whatever scale to create a more equitable society. And on that note, I will send it off to Scott.
Thank you so much. Yes, Scott, please.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Scott Yenner. I'm out here in Boise, Idaho, and I thank the Martin Center and NAS for putting on this webinar. I'll do my best to keep everything concise here. We have written a report, a colleague of mine here in Idaho who works for a local think tank, a state policy network think tank, have written a series of reports on colleges and college systems. We started with doing deep dives on our local universities, Boise State and University of Idaho. And then with other colleagues, we've done things on the University of Tennessee system, University of San Diego, and University of Tennessee, Knoxville. These are all out in the public. And we've also done a study of University of North Carolina system. A couple other studies are coming out later on in the year. When we have written such studies, we do kind of deep, shallow, or medium dives into the university, depending on the needs of the people with whom we're working. But our goal is to partner with people who are on the ground in those states, who have a stake in the report and a stake in the future of the higher education system or university in their place, so that they can then use the report as a kind of spine for activism or just trying to change public opinion about what is going on at the university in their state. We've found that that's to be really important in order to get meaningful change in these circumstances, is to have allies on the ground who are willing to, who know the local circumstances and who can take the report and bring it to people who can try to make changes. And we'll talk a little bit about those changes in a second. We call our reports critical social justice and then at Boise State or at University of Idaho. And we use the term critical social justice intentionally because this is an ideology that is way beyond higher education. It is affecting our police practices. It's affecting our universities as well. And whenever there's a kind of disparity that tells against one of these supposedly underrepresented minority groups, there seems to be the need for a policy to deal with these disparities. So sometimes there's a disparity in SAT scores, so we abolish the SAT. There's a disparity in sentencing in particular crimes, so we abolish the police. And when there's disparities in your engineering department between men and women, or in your physics department between whites and blacks, the preferred policy is DEI. And so DEI is the positive policy that universities pursue to deal with certain disfavored disparities that they have perceived. Sometimes it's an affirmative action program that's probably under the equity rubric, or sometimes it's changing the curriculum fundamentally. And John just talked about some instances of that in the Arizona schools. So DEI is the policy to transform the university to deal with the problems identified by this critical theory analysis. Now, when we do a dive at schools, the things that we look for in order to distinguish one school from another are, well, let me talk about one more thing before I get into that. These kinds of analyses have been around on universities for a long time. I've been a professor now for over 20 years. When I was an undergraduate in the 80s, I wasn't even born, Joel, when you started at Virginia, so I'm sorry. But and my hair is pretty gray. But the classes were dedicated to this. Certain disciplines like sociology or anthropology, where I went to school in Wisconsin, were definitely dominated by this kind of thinking. And there was kind of drift at the university as departments pulled the universities in the direction of favoring this particular ideology, this particular understanding of the world over the course of time. And what has really happened in the last 5 years is that it's no longer drift, and it's not coming from the bottom. Now it's really an administrative directive to transform the universities. And the convenient thing about administrative directives is that they're direct, and they're proud of them. They publicize them, and then they promote them over on the websites. So you can find the reports at these universities where they explicitly take up the task of transforming the university, either an anti-racism task force or a critical justice task force. Sometimes it's before the George Floyd incident. Sometimes it's after. Sometimes it's triggered by a local event. But whatever it is, they let you know what they're going to do and why they want to do it. And it's always consistent with this critical social justice ideology and the DEI as the solution. So it's no longer just drifting, and it's no longer the tenured radicals that are the people that you need to pay attention to. You need to pay attention actually now to the DEI administrators, the associate provost for diversity, equity, inclusion, or the chief diversity officer at the university, because they're the head of a committee, and that committee is doing things. They have minutes, and you can find out precisely what's going on in almost every university by following the personnel that they have hired at the administrative level. So when we took a deep dive into the University of North Carolina system, we started by identifying all of the strategic diversity plans, or DEI plans, for the universities that had them. We identified the chief diversity officer at each university, and how many staff he had or she had. Excuse me, it's almost always a she at the universities. And we tried to find out how much was done at the college level, how many colleges had DEI associate deans, what kind of changes were done to the curriculum. We did what we call a medium dive. What John just did about, let's say, the Northern Arizona example, that's a deeper dive. He looked at the committee meetings when he looked at the standards for how you determine whether a class will be counted as a diversity class. We just counted like the number of requirements, the number of credits, and that's kind of a medium dive. But you can do a deep dive on each university, and it's sometimes efficacious. So here's what we discovered generally when it came to the University of North Carolina system, is that the big 2 or 3 universities, North Carolina State, and East Carolina, had significant DEI infrastructures at the university level and at the college level well before 2020. UNC, we provided a timeline in our account, and I can put that into the chat later on, or maybe someone can do it for me. It's from the Martin Center. They had, but by 2021, when we did the work on it, they had 5 university level administrators making 6 figures. They had 12 university administrators in addition to those 5. North Carolina State had 4 making 6 figures, and they had 21 university level administrators in addition to those 4. Then you look at the college level, 8 out of the 10 colleges at North Carolina had DEI folks on staff, and 10 out of the 12 at North Carolina State. And this really predates 2020. In this particular case, the North Carolina system appointed a anti-racism task force to promote anti-racism ideology in all of the colleges, the 16 colleges in the system. And one of the goals that they set for each college is to hire more DEI administrators and to change their curriculum and to adopt implicit bias training in their hiring processes, and to integrate DEI into faculty evaluations, and to start requiring DEI statements, all of the things that John and John have mentioned earlier. And these are kind of the policy indicators that you get when a university is transforming itself away from professional standards and toward DEI standards as the governing or hegemonic ideology that's going to decide the direction of the university. So we wrote a significant report. It's now in the chat box for the Martin Center, that cataloging what has happened in the North Carolina system. But I do want to actually spend some time talking about what to do about it, because I think this is an important thing. Now, I don't think any of the Band-Aid things work. Banning CRT, or I think those are dead ends. Those are not commensurate to the problem. And selective defunding of universities probably doesn't work either, because money is fungible, it can be worked. There has to be a concerted long-term effort to keep tuition where it is and to cut budgets. And you can cut budgets on the state level, but often the federal government comes in and makes up for it. So there has to be a concerted effort, not only at the state level, but really policy-wise, to set about decreasing the budget, and then requiring that universities be transparent in how they are, making up for their budget's shortfall over the course of time. Now, I'm not even optimistic about the defunding or budget cutting circumstance, because it seems to me that the important thing is to recognize that most universities are fundamentally and irretrievably corrupt. And they are beholden to this ideology, and it can't be legislated out of existence. So I think the other crucial thing is to develop workarounds around colleges and universities. There are tons of state laws that give power to professional organizations to require what it takes to enter into those professional organizations. To become a CPA, according to America's accounting organizations, you have to have a major in accounting. And universities adopt that or know that, and state governments who are in charge of licensing also empower that particular relationship. That needs to change. State governments need to change the licensing requirements for professional to enter certain professions, so that you can actually enter those professions without going to the university. That's an example of a workaround. And then apprenticeships programs need to be established for alternative certification, to be an engineer, to be an accountant, perhaps to be a nurse. And there might be ways of working around the university so that we, in a different way, defund the university. We starve them of students. And especially in the most professional of the organization. So an alternative on this. I think I also favor breaking up most state universities and making them into science and humanities. Not allow the humanities to teach any science and not allow the science to teach any humanities, and then let students go where they would like. If there ends up being a shortfall in the humanities side, well, we have another situation where the universities might have to scale back their ambitions. And if we recognize that this ideology is thoroughgoingly adopted and imposed in many of our most prestigious state schools, then a solution that's commensurate with the problem is a fundamental attempt to get the number of students going to college from whatever it is today, 16, 17 million, down to 5 million in the country. And that can be done by choice. It can be done by providing alternative ways of getting the kinds of certification for serious professions that students would like to enter. So, I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions as we go forward.
Thank you so much. And actually, indeed, my first question is indeed, what is to be done? How do we go about this? Or how do we go about doing this sort of research? How do we make change? I'd actually like to go back to Joel, if I may, your answer on how do we make things better?
Okay, I think there are various paths to follow. At a state university, such as UVA or the ones we're talking about, Arizona, Chapel Hill, the power ultimately resides in the capital. And it's the governor and the attorney general can have significant influence on what's going on at a university. We have a new administration in Richmond now who is very focused on education, not only K-12, but education at higher institutions of learning. And ultimately at the University of Virginia, the power is in the Board of Visitors. The president of the university, the provost, they all report to the Board of Visitors. For the last dozen years or so, the power in Richmond has been in one ideological party. That has changed. And I'm very hopeful, based on various discussions that I've had personally, and I know that others have had, that there are winds of change in Richmond, and that ultimately over the next 4 years, there will be a change in the Board of Visitors, which will hold the administration accountable. And it's not a political, I think we all have to understand this is not a political issue. What we're trying to do is keep politics out of the university. The university is there to educate, not indoctrinate. It's supposed to be a community of scholars, not a community of advocates. But that's what it's turned into. And until the time that we have a Board of Visitors at UVA that's willing to challenge these politically charged decisions that are being made by the administration, there wouldn't be any change. And I think it was Scott who said, you can't do the trivial stuff. You have to go really to the head of the snake. You've got to go to the top and affect change that way. In the interim, I would say to the people who are on this webinar, who are alumni of universities that they care about, get involved. It's the alumni that sit at home that either don't care or they say, what can I do about it? There are now groups of alumni at a growing number of universities who are banding together and who are building a large group and in fact war chests in order to try to challenge what's going on at their alma maters, which they're not happy with. And I think we're starting to have some type of effect there. I think key thing is the depoliticization. And I'll just give a couple of examples. Back in the 1960s, at the University of Chicago during the anti-war demonstrations, they created a committee called the Calvin Committee. And the Calvin Committee's findings and that they issued, frankly, to me, were far more important than what became more famous 5 decades later with the Chicago Principles of Freedom of Expression, which so many colleges adopt and then file in a door and just point to them and never follow. The Calvin Committee said that a university should not be taking institutional positions on political or social agendas. And that, in fact, when that happens, which by the way is just common sense and it's easily observable, it chills the speech. When they do take an institutional position on a political or social agenda, it chills the speech of the students and faculty. And it's common sense that this would happen. And I actually, as one of the lone more conservative members of our Committee on Freedom of Expression, put forth to my committee a paragraph that I asked to be adopted to the rest of my committee. And the response was, well, that's not part of our mandate. And I'm not sure where that came from. That came from up above or from the chairman of my committee. I frankly think it came from the top of the administration. Of course, it's part of our mandate. It's part of any freedom of speech. By definition, it's part of freedom of speech, but they wouldn't listen to it. And this is what I think should be put in front of whether it's board of trustees, board of visitors, whatever they call that head boards that control a university. They should put that paragraph in front of them. Is it right for a university to take a position on a political or social agenda and then implement it across the board? Because remember, the worm will turn. I mean, I asked a senior member of the UVA administration whether they thought that that was appropriate, because I said my paragraph had been shot down. And she said to me, well, she said, I think that universities should be able to take positions that affect the lives of their students. And my response was, well, what issues don't affect the lives of your students? I said, do you think the UVA should be taking an institutional position on abortion? I didn't get a response to that. The phone went totally silent on the other end, because they only want to take positions on, I think, issues that they think that they can cram through, that can get the support of their faculty. And by the way, you're not going to get much support from the faculty on this. I mean, I think as most studies have shown, and I've heard Jonathan Haidt speak twice. He's a former UVA professor at NYU now. I mean, your faculties are probably 90% in one ideological camp. So the remaining 10% are afraid to speak up. There's a handful, and I found at UVA a few that are willing to speak out loud, but most of them are totally intimidated, professionally and or socially. So what we have to do is you've got to get the alumni active, because the faculty is not going to speak up, the students are intimidated or have checked out, and the parents just won't do it because they don't want to hurt their kids that are in school. And what I can tell you what DEI has done at UVA, because I've been intimately involved on a yearly basis throughout with student life, with faculty life, UVA always had a wonderful community that was exemplified by camaraderie and fellowship. And that community is fractured now. It's divided into various vertical, racial, ethnic, and gender groups. We don't have a united body in any way, shape, or form the way it was, at least through the mid-2000s. And it's sad to see. I mean, it's literally sad to see the camaraderie and friendship divided by politics and divided by these issues. And we haven't even discussed cancel culture, which is in full-blown existence, at least at UVA, through the student body as well as the faculty. So how do we change it? Get your alumni involved together and to speak up and not just listen to the bromides you'll get on a regular basis from the administration. And number two, if you're in a state university, you work for the change in the capital. And then once that's done, you make sure you lobby for a depoliticization of the universities. You don't lobby for any political issue because it's not, you're not pressing a political issue or a political theory. All we're asking for is a free and open playing field for the free exchange of ideas and mutual respect of ideas, which does not exist at UVA, and I dare say exists at very, very few campuses across the country.
Thank you. And John, words you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. So I agree with Scott that a lot of these problems actually can be traced back to the fact that university education is massively overemphasized, and we essentially tell every student who's bright and capable, you must go to university. That's the absolute best way to do it. So you know, even if you don't like how they're being how you will be taught, too bad. Go to these very narrowly defined institutions. That causes all sorts of problems. You know, and I think that thinking bigger about the issue is refreshing and helpful. I do think that there are some ways to you know, reform the university, and in some instances I'm less optimistic that we can create sort of parallel institutions that will have enough sway to really change anything. So I'm thinking about medical schools, which are just very difficult to create. I have a hard time seeing a lot of new medical schools being created or new medical routes to medical licensing existing. And actually, in Scott, in your own report, one of the most interesting points, or at least one of the points that I found most interesting, is that medical schools happen to be some of the places where DEI is most entrenched. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but you know, there's something to be said for taking that head on. And I would propose two things to look at. First, institutional incentives, and second, public pressure. So right now, this is changing slightly, but there is almost no institutional incentive for anyone to oppose DEI measures. For a long time, they were seen as relatively innocuous, and more recently, even if they're seen as controversial, the cost of opposing DEI measures, I mean, in some cases, there can be real professional ramifications, especially if your tenure and promotion requires you to display a commitment to DEI. But there's very little institutional incentive to push back. And I think that some of that can be changed by law. So for instance, just yes, defunding in some ways, creating alternative accreditation requirements. So accreditation is often an institutional incentive that people in the kind of higher education administration point to as a reason that their DEI requirements exist in the first place. They say it's not really us, it's the accreditors, which recently happened with UNC Chapel Hill's School of Medicine when they came under fire for their DEI programming. I think that it's also worth considering that there is a massive bureaucratic incentive for these programs to exist because there are people whose jobs depend on it. You know, there are numerous DEI officers. A few people have suggested this, and I think it might be a promising route. Why not try to create some other bureaucratic office that pushes back against parts of these, or at least some that creates at least some limiting principle, like an office of free speech that could enforce various measures that you might institute against the excesses of DEI. The other thing I would suggest is just creating more avenues for public pressure. So maximal transparency, making it so that every DEI training out there, every DEI committee meeting out there has to be open and available. And if that's the case, then I think that the public pressure we see kind of rising up towards K-12 schools could be emulated, in which case you could at least enact certain policies like banning required DEI statements and just tipping the scale back in favor of some faculty members who might then be more emboldened to push back. Those aren't I do think that those solutions are maybe a first step, but they I'm optimistic that some progress can be made by doing that.
I'll be very short, David. I mean, the way I would just put it is that that policies, small ball policies like banning DEI and going after affirmative action, which used to be like the centerpiece of conservative activism when it came to higher ed reform, are really only important in changing public opinion. It's going to be very difficult to move these institutions, and and it's going to be very difficult to rally legislatures, boards of trustees. It's going to be very difficult to change accreditation or professionalization requirements without changing public opinion. And getting a constituency to change public opinion is really what exposing the radicalism of today's universities is all about, because the constituencies have to be national and state. And so the more we talk about how critical social justice ideology has penetrated kindergarten and pre-K, that's going to have effects on the college stuff. And I think it's important to do all of that, because without stigmatizing the ideology and making the ideology kind of like being a communist or being a Hittite in America, like until it's to that point, it's going to be very difficult. They may really have any meaningful change. When Joel was talking, I was remembering William F. Buckley's recommendations in God and Man at Yale, where he said we really have to go after the boards of trustees and get them to take action. And when was that written? 52, 54? Man, like, it's difficult unless you take on the ideology. And so I think that's really the centerpiece of anything that's going to be done.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from the audience. Ray Sanchez, actually. Has there been any deep dive into the extensive DEI push, DIE push, in community and technical colleges? The California community college system is completely radicalized top to bottom. Any more details, but how much has there been on the community colleges? How much do we think there is there? What can be done to find out more about the community colleges?
Yeah, I'm in this lane a lot, so I think John is also in this lane a lot. But I don't know much about what's been done at community colleges. What I think would be helpful to have is a kind of before and after picture of how college and community colleges affect students on this question. And I think that would be like, I think we're to the point where we've documented this stuff enough. Let's talk about why this causes the country to fall apart, and what kind of citizens this is promoting. So, I mean, I think we can and should do something on community colleges, and doing them in California is going to the belly of the beast on it. Doing them in Idaho would probably be, you'd find the similar thing, but less. But I really do think that stigmatizing the ideology is really the next stage and the sine qua non of any additional reform.
Other people in community colleges.
I would just expect that pretty much anywhere you look, you're going to find either a college system or a particular college somewhere along that on that pathway towards total DEI takeover. This is the kind of thing that after one university enacts a policy, that policy is becomes more public and is considered cutting edge, and other universities follow suit. Considering also that diversity officers consult with one another and often move from institution to institution. So I wouldn't be surprised if the people in charge of the diversity efforts in California's community college system, their junior college system, wouldn't be surprised if they at one time were in the UC system, and they're probably copying and pasting a lot of those policies. And plus, some smaller universities and less prestigious universities actually want to distinguish themselves by being more cutting edge, and so they'll actually jump on these policies earlier. So those forces make me think that it's absolutely there. And you are welcome to send me any and all information that you have. I look at these things often. I report on these things often, and I'm very interested in that question.
And Joel, did you want to add anything on that, or?
I generally like to speak on something that I have some significant knowledge about. I don't have it on community colleges, so I'll leave it to my colleagues who have more involvement in that area.
All right. I am going to ask about, accreditation. I mean, this really does seem to be a central can of worms. How do we deal with the accreditors? 5 minutes or less. You have an answer, I know. How do we start to deal with the accreditors?
You want to do this, John, or me? Or Joel, who wants to go? So my experience with this is that, so let's look at the North Carolina system for a second. The North Carolina system has a range of schools, and some of them have almost no DEI presence. They're usually less well-funded than University of North Carolina. They can't afford it. They just have no infrastructure for that stuff. And they're under the same accreditation system as North Carolina and North Carolina State. So I think often accreditation is used to justify things that they want to do, and they're looking for cover. And so finding examples of public and private universities that haven't gone as far as universities that are using accreditation to justify what they're doing, I think is part of a good argument against that. That being said, I mean, I understand that there are demands and accreditation that point in this direction. I would just always say in response to that accreditation standards can be met in any number of ways. And schools that think that they have to build up 94, was it, Joel? 94 administrators, dedicated DEI, and then they use accreditation as a crutch on this, they're lying. And we have to recognize that they're lying, and they should be treated like they're lying.
I would say I think that is true to an extent, because often what I found is that accreditors or that universities hide behind accreditation, or at least I've seen instances of that seeming to happen. So for instance, and this happens in other common cases where accreditors are blamed. So when people talk about private schools, they often say, well, the private school accreditation system is what's causing all of these schools to go crazy. But if you look at when almost every single major DEI policy was enacted, it was at private schools, they were almost all enacted in June of 2020 in response to a specific basically social media campaign by students and alumni. So there is an extent to which the accreditors don't always have as much power as we might think they do. But I will say there are certain instances of universities or specific schools within universities establishing drastic policies that I think are best explained by accreditation pressure. So you see this with medical schools, and I'll be writing about this soon, where the LCME has pretty stringent requirement, or actually pretty vague requirements, but it seems that the only way for medical schools to meet these requirements is to enact various pretty extensive policies, which I really think explains the fact that medical schools in North Carolina have just a disproportionate number of DEI officers. You know, the UNC Chapel Hill's medical school, 800 students. They have 8 DEI officers, whereas UNC Chapel Hill, their general student body is 31,000. You know, that's a huge disproportion going straight to the medical school. And that leads me to believe that accreditors for specific types of schools are doing that. I haven't looked into this, but I think it's certainly the case with engineering as well, which you might expect to be the case. So to the extent that the DEI efforts are driven by professors or people on DEI committees, you would expect it to be most radical in places like English departments, basically humanities and social sciences. But the fact that it's showing up in sciences, where actually I think if you're going to get any kind of institute, any kind of sort of faculty support saying, no, we actually like things like standards, meritocracy, equality rather than equity, you would expect that from the science faculties. And every now and then, if you look at accreditation standards for things like engineering and science, you find instances of accreditors saying you have to implement this particular kind of policy. So either way, I guess to David's original question, what do you do? Well, most accreditors have to be acknowledged or are acknowledged by the state. That's the case for the LCME, which accredits medical schools. That's the case for the American Bar Association, which accredits law schools, which means that if you have a state government or if you have a federal government that does not like DEI, hypothetically, you can say, no, you are not going to be acknowledged if this is what you're requiring. And I think at the very least, that can be that should be a policy option that we have in our pockets.
It's not exactly an accreditation point, but it goes to some of what my colleagues were just talking about in terms of bureaucratic bloat, which encompasses DEI and so many other issues. When I wrote my book about my undergraduate years at UVA, I noted that my tuition as an out-of-state student in 1966 was $1,000. If you add inflation since that time, the equivalent amount today for tuition would be around $9,000, when it actually is around $50,000, close to $50,000, going up towards $50,000. The amount of bureaucratic bloat at our major universities is outrageous. And I would think, not having been a member, an official member of the faculty, but of having taught just as a guest lecturer, but the faculty members want to know why so much of the budget of a university is going into dean's offices and the president's office and the DEI office and all these other offices, when it should be going into what's the most important thing about a university, which are its students and its instructors. The bureaucratic monstrosities that have grown at each of these universities need to be addressed. DEI is one, because you could eliminate probably 90% or 100% as far as I'm concerned, but certainly 90% of your DEI bureaucracy and not skip a beat, and the students would not learn any less, and there wouldn't be any less quote unquote fairness on the campuses. So I'm just stunned why you don't have the faculty there trying to speak up about that.
I'm going to put in another question to the three of you. So it is now December 2024. President-elect Ron DeSantis has just appointed me Secretary of Education. I have been wafted by a favoring gale. And I summoned all of you in to say there are priorities are going to be 3 administrative rule changes at the Department of Education and 1 political push from the president for a change of law to put a spike into DEI as best we can. What are your suggestions for the priorities? What practically can be done at the federal level? That's worth concentrating on first.
There are a lot of, at least very easy, sort of low-hanging fruit policies. So what comes to mind would be addressing racial preferences and addressing DEI, mandatory DEI statements in whatever way the federal government is able to. But frankly, it's such a big question. It's hard to give a succinct answer.
I'm going to give a radical answer to that. What I would do is undertake an investigation of the universities for discriminating against men in their grades and in their admissions process, and I would use disparate impact against the universities to seek to get large settlements for the discriminatory practices that the disparate grades and admission standards obviously reflect. And I would make that my major push. That's a prelude to doing some of the things that John mentioned, but this is just an effort to expose universities for what they have become in adopting the policies of DEI.
And I just add to what Scott was saying, I think, and to what I had said earlier, I think the most important policy goal of any new administration and anybody in charge of education in this country would be the depoliticization of our schools, is to keep politics and social issues out of our schools. And it flows into so many different areas. I mean, getting on what Scott was saying, I mean, it's absolutely true. It's funny, you hear all the time the jargon of the woke crowd being underrepresented groups or marginalized groups. I mean, I think if you looked at UVA today, you'd say that the most marginalized and probably underrepresented groups amongst the students and faculty would be white males, would be fraternity members amongst the student body, and amongst fundamentalist Christians. I think, those groups, are probably the most marginalized. And I think it's to look at it, you're supposed to be looking at every group fairly. When we had the Unite the Right event in Charlottesville, the only connection really with UVA was one evening they marched down the lawn, which is, Thomas Jefferson's original academic village. And they did a tiki torch march, the white nationalists down the lawn. None of them, and they were screaming out a chant, but the chant they were screaming out was not a racially motivated chant. It was an anti-Semitic chant. What they were screaming out was, Jews won't replace us. But that was the nexus with UVA, but nothing that flowed from that had anything to do with anti-Semitism. it all flowed back to the so-called marginalized groups who hadn't been attacked on the grounds of the University of Virginia. And these so-called marginalized groups, which may in fact have been marginalized when I was in college. I mean, UVA was still an all-men's school until the year I graduated, so I guess there were no women in Charlottesville except for nursing and education. They weren't in the college or the engineering school or the architecture school. Yes, there were groups that were marginalized, for sure. That was 50 years ago. Those same groups are not marginalized now. And what I'll leave is a conversation I had, again, with a very senior administrator at UVA when I raised that issue about so-called marginalized groups and so-called underrepresented groups, when saying it's just not the case, and putting forth to him the groups that are marginalized today. And the response I got stunned me, which was, well, that's the way it's always been. Different groups were marginalized decades ago. Now we've got new groups being marginalized. And that was some type of a justification going back to the biblical invocation of not having the sins of the parents visited upon the heads of their children. In essence, the response I received, and by the way, I got almost the exact response from more than one senior administrator, is that that's okay. It's okay to do that now. And that stunned me, that we have people running major universities that actually believe that. What we've got to push for is, as much as we can, to have determinations amongst the students and the faculty based on the content of their character and their merits, and not based on their race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. And that is what the Department of Education should be pushing.
Thank you. Let me see. I'm going to have, I think this may be a last question before the end and concluding statements. There was a question about what can one say to other faculty member, and I suppose the fact I've been hearing a certain amount of the council of despair. In effect, they are so lost into how should I put it? Many are willing ill with all their fanatical might, and others are too scared ever to do anything. But is there any hope to persuade people to get out of being pro-DEI, to get them to be brave enough to stand up to this? Faculty, staff, anybody, students, anybody within the institution. Can sweet talk and persuasion work in any way? And if so, what's the line to use?
Well, I'll take the first one on this, David. I don't think sweet talk works. I think basically today, most of universities are being run by either ideologues or careerists. And if they're ideologues, they actually believe, and I think many of them do, they actually believe in what they're doing, and that's fine. I mean, we all have our own ideologies, except, what one administrator thinks is good is generally a normative belief, and it's not necessarily what other people think is good. But if they're an ideologue, you're not going to change their views with sweet talk. And if they're a careerist looking at their present position as a stepping stone towards the next one up, elevating from UVA to Yale or Harvard or Stanford, you're not going to do something that's going to rock the boat as long as the ideologues are in charge of the other institutions as well. You're not going to do what's right if it's going to jeopardize your future opportunities. So sweet talk doesn't, I think, have any, will have any effect on these. I mean, I've done that for a decade. We've pushed it for a decade. We've organized. It's finally, I think we're getting a hearing now because just what happened in Virginia. I think parents and members of the political community have had enough of being indoctrinated and having their children indoctrinated. And at some point, when you shine the light of truth on what's actually going on, which is so important. And I think either John or Scott talked about that before, shining the light of truth on what's going on. Once the light is shined on them, people truly understand and get motivated. It's only going to be money or political pressure. And for me, unfortunately, some of these schools have such huge endowments that just having a couple of thousand alumni cut off their $500 yearly donation or $1,000 isn't going to have an effect. Maybe if some of the major donors come up and say, enough, we've had enough. But I think it's going to really have to come from the top. It's going to have to come from whoever the board is or the governor or somebody to make a material change in what's going on.
Thank you. John, do you have thoughts?
On how to make,
Can one have a line of sweet persuasion at all? Would any work? And if so, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm not sure. As you know, I've spent a lot less time in universities either than either Scott or Joel have. I'll say two things that can be helpful. One, I've said this a couple times, but there are these institutional pressures that make it a really just a career liability for certain people to speak up, and it might, absent reform, just be almost impossible to get some skeptical professors to actually voice their skepticism. You're effectively asking them to tank their careers. Maybe more people should be willing to really put their career, or I think more people should be willing to put their career out on the line. But getting to the point where you're a career academic, where you actually have a university position, is just so extraordinarily rare. It's a really, really difficult job to get in the first place. You have to jump through multiple hoops to even get there. So one thing you definitely need is just to have more tenured faculty speak up and remove those institutional barriers. But I would also say that my impression is that there is a lot of thoughtlessness. So it's no real surprise to me that a lot of the information that and the ideology that is being handed out by DEI practitioners is incredibly shallow. And it is partially because these people are bureaucrats. Their job is not to think, their job is to serve a bureaucratic function. And so being thoughtful is not necessarily what they need to do. And they encourage you to accept these ideas, not on the basis of their reality, but on the basis of basically power, which means that often they are very flimsy ideas. And often people's commitment to them is based on something other than seeing that they are true, and more likely they're based on being afraid. And when people base what they believe on thoughtlessness, and that does create an opening. I'm not especially optimistic that a lot of people are going in the university are going to change their mind, but at the very least, I think that sometimes these things are weaker than they appear. And that's in my mind is the case when it comes to DEI.
Thank you. And Scott?
Yeah, I'll just briefly weigh in. I mean, as one of these professors that has spoken out, I will say that the example of the way the I would say university has made an example of me has not encouraged others to speak up, but I'm all right with that, because the issue thing that I think people could understand is that tenure makes people company men, and they're thinking about what it's going to be like there for the next 30 years. It doesn't encourage independence. It encourages an extreme sort of dependence and a risk aversion, not in most people. I mean, unless you're a little bit on the spectrum, you want to get along with people. And so the sweet talk mode can work if you're in a group of careerists who are thinking about the long term and how their interest will be served in the long term. But those are big ifs, and maybe eliminating tenure is the best way to get people to recognize the importance of independence of mind.
Thank you. Look, thank you all very much. I'm going to ask each of you if you could, just for a minute or so, a final bit, concluding remarks, stuff you hadn't gotten a chance to say, and then I'll just wrap up for the webinar. Let's say same order, I guess. Joel Gardner, would you be so kind as to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think the best advice I can offer to people who are listening, who are concerned, is to get involved. I think that's what it takes. People who either want to sit back and complain or ignore it. It's the future of our country. Education is the future of our country. And for the past at least 20 years, our kids from kindergarten up have been indoctrinated with one social ideological viewpoint. And they're not given the opportunity to try to judge different ideas because they really have not been in any way, shape, or form given even opportunities to hear two sides. So I would say alumni, parents, members of faculties out there who are affiliated with the university, try to speak up and make sure you're heard, not only by the administration, but heard by the board, heard by other alumni, and talk about what our most precious treasure, which is our children. That is the future. We've already basically lost a generation. You read any of the studies that take a look at the Gen Z, or whatever they're calling them these days, the last 10, 15 years. And I think it's very much a lost generation. We can't afford to lose another generation to indoctrination and intimidation.
Thank you. John.
I think there's been a lot of sort of doomerism in this discussion, some of which comes straight from me. It can often seem really, really depressing when you read into, when you do the kind of research that we've done, you're thinking about policy in this area. So I would say that given that the policy the policy climate in the United States is different than it has been in a long, long time regarding these issues, that opens up the possibility for at least small victories. And while there are certain challenges in the universities related to DEI that seem insurmountable, there are also promising steps forward when we're talking about the fact, going back to the 2 points that I made. First, that this is institutional policy, and second, that it has become the de facto core curriculum. Both of those can be reversed. You can ban the use of DEI statements. You can ban mandatory DEI trainings. You can ban, or you can make every single training transparent such that public support for DEI drops even more and universities are actually more accountable than they have been in the past. You can make it so that these courses, yes, while professors are welcome to believe and espouse whatever views they want, those courses are not, you can, without violating academic freedom at all, say that this should not be a requirement for every student, and instead take a little bit more control of the core curriculum and say, no, we want every student to take courses that are actually good for them. So we have many reasons to despair, but also many reasons to be optimistic. And there are things that we can do even in the present to change this.
Thank you. All right, Scott.
I'll just be very quick. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us to the end. I just think we have to think about what the goal is. There will always be a brand of education that is honored in a country. And any of the mechanical things that we do, defund schools, get workarounds from the universities, ban DEI statements. All of these are functional things that attempt for carve-outs or something like that. But that's ultimately a position of weakness. The ultimate goal is to look at the public school system and our dominant ideology, expose it as false and dangerous for a free people, and replace it with one that appreciates the bounties of our civilization and its greatness. Like, that is what we're after. And whatever policy that you adopt has to be, in my view, connected to that as the long-term goal that you're pursuing. I don't know that there's any difference of opinion among us on that question. But if we can't hunker down in a defensive position where we just shut down a current institution, we have to build an alternative understanding of what kind of education is honored. And that's the ultimate goal of any education reform.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to our audience. We can't do it without you, and your questions are what makes this a conversation, and gets us to think better and speak better. Thank you very much to the James Martin Center, with whom we are co-hosting, and which again has published two of the three speakers here, Scott Yenner and Joel Gardner. They're doing wonderful work. The NAS is continuing to work on this subject. This is not one of our regular webinar series like our Great American History webinar or our Great American Literature webinar, but we are continuing to do stuff having to do with reform, higher education reform. For example, on March 3rd, I believe that is, we will be having something on academic transparency, different proposals, how to get academic transparency bills into the state. So if you like this webinar, you might like that one too. All right, so thank you all very much. And I'll just remind, if you have a question that wasn't answered, send it to me, email randall@nas.org. And this will be up on our YouTube website channel within 24 hours. You'll be able to see this. Your friends will be able to see it. It'll be wonderful. Thank you all so much.